Chapter 11. Master Damien. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Penny, who had been frightful previously, looked in the direction where everyone's eyes started to move at one man from far behind. At first, the man was only a silhouette, but when he started to walk, people moved away from him to make way so that he could walk. She saw him walk where the stage was set up. Every step of his bringing him closer to where she was, while his view only got clearer. His eyes were set on hers and hers on his. She had seen plenty of handsome men in her village and the town around, but none could compare to this man. When he finally came close, she took note of his red eyes that were dark. His cheekbones high, eyebrows dark, with a thick black straight mane that he had left to be disheveled. As they stared at each other, she saw something dark and dangerous lurk behind his eyes, which put her on an alert. There was a piece of stick which played at the edge of his lips, stopping only when he came to stand in front of the stage. Master Damien the Bitter greeted the man with a nervous undertone in his voice. "Are you buying the slave?" The man didn't break his gaze away from the young girl who was staring just like he did. The Bitter, seeing this, took it in a different way, that the master was being offended by the girl maintaining her eye contact. Frank pushed the girl's head down quickly, and her head bent due to him pushing her down so that she would show some respect to the elite pure-blooded vampire. With the man's gaze broken away, he looked up at Frank. The gold will be delivered to you in an hour," the man named Damien stated, not wanting to rebuke any argument. "Of course." Frank bowed his head with his hand still holding down the girl's head. The man stepped on the stage with one jump, swiftly like a cat, before standing up. "Hands off." The man didn't understand what he meant out of pure happiness that they had sold a girl for 5,000 gold coins. That was money one of his kind could only dream to have. "Take your hands off my belonging," the man didn't need to be told twice. He quickly moved his hand away from the slave whose head he had been pushing. "You can collect her from the back side of the stage," Frank replied back, keeping a step distance from the girl as the man glared down at him. Compared to Frank, who was of average height for a man, this man who stood in front of them towered in his height. With the grubby man's hand not on her anymore, Penny wanted to look at the man who had bought her, but with his gaze that came back at her, she felt intimidated. With the way the man who had been rude and disgraceful with all the slaves, he now seemed like a shaking leaf. Already having enough sight and plight of what the slaves had to go through, Penny didn't want to risk looking at him. "You can keep this one as your deposit to collect the gold." She saw the pure-blooded vampire pull out a bag that jingled softly. He handed it over to Frank. "Please, Master Damien." "We don't need the deposit," said Frank with a small laugh to let the man know he trusted that they would be paid. Damien didn't respond to it. Instead, he gave one look at the young woman who stood in front of him. He bit into the twig that he had been playing with in his mouth. Not saying anything, he turned around, jumping down from the stage that had been set up to walk around and towards the backstage. A smaller man followed him, hot on his trail, who looked a little shocked, just like the people who had witnessed what just happened. Frank, clearing his throat, went to sell the next slave. "We have another young girl just as beautiful as the previous one. You won't be disappointed," he shouted. Penny was taken back in from where she had come, going back to the tent which had gotten darker before she had left. With the last but one slave now being sold out in the open, it was only the guardsman, the elder woman, and her. "Sir Damien," spoke Cream, who had caught up with the senior councilman. The black market was no place to wander, and if it weren't for the man whom he was serving, he would have never stepped into this place. People here were not who they seemed to be, and it wasn't just humans and vampires who walked in and out. There were white witches and the black witches. The last thing he wanted was to be butchered by a witch, to be turned and saved as a potion in the bottle. At 1 point, Cream had been looking at the woman who had been calling him through action, which he ignored, knowing how people here were. 1 second and he had lost the man from his sight to make an announcement of giving out 5,000 gold coins. His eyes had bulged out hearing it. "Get the carriage here," Cream ordered Damien, dismissing their current work as they had already acquired the information they had come for. "Will you be going home?" "Yes." "Now quick," said Damien, spitting the twig out of his mouth before entering the tent to see the girl he had just bought. She was the same girl, thought Damien to himself as he walked towards her. He hadn't expected to see her here, not in this state, but he was here now. At first, when his eyes fell on her with the man bidding her, it had caught him by surprise. It was the same girl whom he had seen a week ago in the rain. Her clothes were dirty, the one which slaves usually wore in the slave establishment. Her hair looked like it hadn't been washed for a while where it stuck above her head. As he drank in her appearance, he found her looking at the ground without meeting his eyes. Penny could feel the man's gaze burning at her, and she wished he wasn't looking at her in such intensity that made her want to cower behind the wall. She didn't know what to do and fretted internally as to what was going to happen. When the woman in the cell room had told her the escape plan, she had thought it would be easy as there wouldn't be any guards to catch hold of her once she would be sold off. But now it worried her. The man who had bought her, he didn't seem like an ordinary man. "Mr. Quinn," the guardsman bowed his head to show respect to the man. The guardsman didn't bother to make small talk and instead kept his head lowered with the last slave that had to be sold. But the man blatantly ignored the guardsman and came to stand right in front of Penny. Penny, who had been quiet while avoiding his gaze, saw the pair of leather shoes that came into view in front of her eyes. Lifting her head slowly, she found the man looking at her. As if his red eyes were inspecting her closely. Her eyes widened when his hand shot up to hold her chin. "The cut looks fresh." "Who gave it to you?" She was too shocked to reply with his sudden forwardness over her to answer. She moved her head away so that he wouldn't continue to hold her chin. "Speak." "The man out there," she answered. He replied as if in acknowledgement. Penny didn't know what they were doing standing here, as she had heard the rest of the gold coins would be handed at the man's mansion. With more time passing by, Frank came back with the slave he had just sold. "Master Damien," Frank bowed again, seeing the man in front of her, "are you looking for another slave today? Do you have something sharp that you could remove the binds?" said Damien, glancing at the girl's bind for Frank to nod his head. "Oh, yes we do. There must be a knife here somewhere," said the human, who let go of the slave he had been holding by the arm tightly when he brought her back inside to go fetch the knife. Coming back with the small knife, the man went to the pure-blooded vampire who had requested for a knife. "Here it is," he handed it over. "Is it sharp enough?" asked the pure-blooded vampire, bringing the knife close to his face to inspect it. Yes. Very sharp. I got it chiseled and sharpened last evening," confirmed the man. "Lovely," remarked Damien, turning the knife in his hand. In a blink of an eye, Penny didn't know what happened, but the man's hand had turned to a vegetable as it had been stabbed by the same knife he had given to the pure-blooded vampire on the nearest wall. Thankfully there wasn't a table where he had stabbed it onto, else the knife would have pierced through to let its sharp end to poke from the man's backhand. The man screamed in pain of having his skin torn, feeling the burn spreading across his entire hand. "Master Damien, please forgive me." Penny frowned hearing this. Since the time she had the blindfold removed from her eyes, she hadn't seen him talk to the pure-blooded vampire. At least not until she was being sold to the crowd. "You damaged the precious slave I just bought. How do you mean to pay for the damage you caused?" She then realized why he did it, and heart shuddered at the thought of it. "Please forgive me," he cried in the tent. Though his voice could be heard here, one couldn't hear him from outside due to the amount of crowd that had come to form with the slaves being sold. It was one of the days in the week where people hovered in the black market for more than one reason. The man begged, asking his hand to be released, but the pure-blooded vampire was having none of it. It was as if he was bored and had picked this man to be his target. "Please allow me to mend it," pleaded the human. "Are you going to time travel?" There was a depth of huskiness as the pure-blooded vampire questioned Frank, whose hand had started to bleed. "Does he, Fuller?" The question was posed to the guardsman from the slave establishment, who didn't dare to defy the pure-blooded vampire. Penny saw him twist the knife and she cringed when the man cried out, "Are you sorry?" "Yes, please forgive me." The man begged, and Damien finally pulled out knife from the man's hand. You have the ability to strike a slave but cannot hold the same pain when it is inflicted on you. The people who had witnessed it along with the one who was in grave pain had the thought cross in their mind that slapping and stabbing one with the knife had a lot of difference. Pathetic. I will be taking the slave. Don't forget to collect the 3,000 gold coins at the mansion. Frank gave the man a ridiculous look, his mouth hanging open. Had the master not spoken about taking the slave for 5,000 gold coins? We are leaving, announced the man named Damien, ready to leave when he saw the man whose hand he had staked look at him confused. Master Damien, you said you would give 5,000 gold coins. After being stabbed with the knife he wasn't sure if his heart and body was ready for another attack by the man. He had heard enough of Damien Quinn. The man came from the highest elite of the society, his family one of the oldest pure-blooded vampire who had come into existence first. Though having enough money where his grandchildren wouldn't need to lift a finger for a meal, he worked for the council. But this was only his work and family background. Coming to his character or behavior, various people gave different versions about him, but one of the most common characteristics was that he was one of the evil pure-blooded vampires. Not many spoke of it, but there was always a differentiation when it came to the kind of creatures that walked on the four lands of the empire. Valeria, Bone Lake, Mythweald and Woeville. There were types where some didn't bother with the others and others who didn't know to mind their business. But there were some who were insane and didn't get punished. Damien Quinn was the man who belonged to this category. Call it as luck or the connections he and his family had, but the man didn't miss an opportunity to make a person suffer. His dislike for humans was not a secret, but then, the man looked down upon even the vampires and some of the pure-blooded vampires. His words were sharp and taunting most of the times like a snake. Damien, who had readied himself to leave with the slave who he had bought, gave a look which looked one of annoyance. What? I shall collect the gold coins in the evening, Frank corrected himself. Chapter 12. Master Damien. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The carriage at a pace that had Penny place her bare feet firmly on the surface so that she wouldn't fall from her seat. After dealing with the man and the guardsman, the man named Damien Quinn had taken her to the carriage and they now headed to his mansion. He didn't speak to her and she had no voice right now, not after seeing Frank who had been stabbed quite brutally. She had never seen a display of blood like that, and the way this pure-blooded vampire had dealt as if poking a lump of meat to check if it were cooked. The only difference was that it wasn't meat but a man's hand. Even though her hands were unbound before getting inside the carriage, she still felt as if they were still being bound by the coarse ropes that had left mark on her skin in the presence of this man who sat next to her. Discreetly making sure he wasn't seeing, she looked from the corner of her eyes to see his leg crossed one leg over the other. His face turned to look at the window, the view outside as they passed through the hills. From where she sat, Penny could see how handsome he was with the silhouette like a shadow. Sharp jaw and cheekbones, brooding eyebrows with some of his inky black hair that fell on them. Before he could catch her staring at him, she quickly turned her head away but subtly to make sure he didn't notice her or rather forgot that she existed, but Penny didn't know that the man had been more than aware of her presence in the carriage. Though his eyes were looking outside the window, when the girl shifted slightly away from him, his eyes moved from right to left to watch her. While Penny tried to be quiet, her stomach had different ideas. Her stomach growled once, then twice before going on for the man to tap the front window to gain the coachman's attention. Unlike some who had only one coachman, this man had two men riding in the front of the carriage. Stop at Claire's, the one who wasn't riding nodded to direct the other coachman on the order received. When was the last time you had a meal? Asked the pure-blooded vampire who hadn't spoken to her directly after asking who had caused the wound on her mouth. A little taken aback from the sudden question, she turned her face to see him already looking at her. Last evening, she answered, feeling lightheaded due to the lack of sleep as well as food which was never sufficient for the slaves. The slaves were underfed to keep their body lean, but there was also another reason for it which Damien was aware of. By providing an insufficient quantity of food to the slaves, it made them weak, which made it easier to turn them obedient to listen to the guardsmen. Seeing him not answer but continue to stare at her, Penny looked away from him. The more he stared at her, the more it got uncomfortable. She wanted to say, "Stop staring at me," but she wasn't courageous enough to do it. There was just something about this man that made her believe that it wouldn't be right to speak back at him. The last thing she wanted was to be stabbed by him. Best was ignoring him, and she did just that until the carriage came to a halt. When the door opened, he opened the door without waiting for the coachman, the door almost hitting the lower man to step aside, bowing his head. She had to be careful as she stepped down from the carriage. Her hands were free but her legs weren't, they were still shackled with a single chain that connected either side of the leg so that it would prevent her from moving fast. Penny looked at the small building that had a board put upon it, Claire's Inn. The man had stopped to feed her. It confused her to no end. She had heard some of the stories regarding the slaves on how difficult it was for them with their overbearing owners who treated them worse than a dog or any other lower animal. Slaves were never treated well. They were the filth who weren't counted in society. With the various decrees of creatures who walked on these lands like humans, vampires, pure-blooded vampires, the two different witches, the society was further partitioned into a class where the pure-blooded vampires were of the highest being, considered to be elites, while it wasn't humans who were positioned at the bottom. There were some humans who had managed to be in the good grace of others to have a better life. It was the slaves who stood at the bottom where people didn't take their life into account. The very purpose of the slaves was to serve the people who bought them or the people their master or mistress asked to serve. They were the caged beings who didn't have a life of their own. Penny, who had a sheltered life without having to look into this part of the world, didn't know what to make of this man's behavior. The man hadn't treated her badly, but that didn't mean he would continue to be the way he was. To think that this man had gone far enough to stop the carriage so that she could be fed. She wondered if the man was going to feed the goat before the goat was butchered, thought Penny to herself. But then, thought Penny to herself, she had been saved from her clothes being torn down for the public to see. If it weren't for him, she didn't know what trauma she would have gone through after that. When they entered the inn, Penny noticed the way some of the passers-by gave her looks at the sight of her dress and the clink of the sound that came from her legs due to the metal chains. The inn looked as good as a mansion would, and by the look of the people who were in here, the clothes that they wore were enough to know that this was no ordinary inn. It was designed specially for the vampires, as every one of them possessed to have red eyes. Some that were light, some that were dark. Amongst them were some women who were humans who were being wooed by men. As she continued to walk, she couldn't help but start to devise a plan so that she could run away from here without being caught. The black market was far away, and now that there were no guards, all she had to do was slip from here without anyone's notice to have her life of freedom again. Ignoring the looks the people in the inn gave her, she looked for the doors and windows, every possible exit that she could make use of right now. The young woman didn't fail to notice the whisper that went among the people while they stared at her. She continued to walk, following the man who was being led by the owner of the inn. Coming to an empty room, the pure-blooded vampire was asked to sit and the owner left the room closed. Penny hadn't been asked to sit, therefore she continued to stand without a word. The room was small but enough to accommodate two people spaciously for a meal. "What's your name?" the pure-blooded vampire named Damien asked, his back leaning against the cushioned chair. Penny, I mean Penelope," she corrected to give out her full name. "Penny," he tested out her name as the name rolled out of his tongue. "I am Damien Quinn, and from today on you shall answer to only me, do you understand?" It wasn't a question but a demand. Receiving no response from her, he stood up from his seat, the chair screeching on the floor. She took a step back when he approached her, her feet not moving too far due to the chain which almost made her stumble back and fall if it weren't for the wall that was right behind her. When her back did hit the fall, the man came to stand right in front of her. He placed the palm of his hand on the wall right next to her head. His body leaning forward to see the girl's eyes wide. "I noticed the little pause when you were brought to the stage. What was that about?" he asked her. Not wanting to take a chance, she answered, keeping a passive face while internally there was a fire going in there. "I don't know. Really, the closer he got, the more she tried to move until he placed another hand on the other side of her head. Where do you think you are going, little mouse? Answer me before I do something you wouldn't like, he taunted her, his eyes looking straight into the depth of her soul. Your heart has been beating loudly since we arrived here. There was a smile on his face, but it wasn't friendly in the slightest. Penny didn't know what and how to answer it. Since the time she had started to devise a plan of escape in her head, Penny hadn't realized that her heartbeat had been fluctuating up and down for the man who had brought her to notice. Shall I answer it for you? She heard him ask, the creepy smile that had made way continuing to exist on his lips. Damien Quinn was a handsome man and Penny had agreed on it the first time he had jumped on the stage to look at her, but no matter how handsome he was, there was something very dangerous about him. Maybe it was the madness in his eyes, that he didn't bother to hide. It was only one question, she said, her eyes staring into his. You speak more freely than normal slaves do. It seems like they let you go too soon. Shall we go clarify it? The pure-blooded vampire's tone was casual, but he picked the smell of worry and fear that spilled out of her eyes, which was clear as day. Am I right? He smiled, his eyes crinkling with sheer amuse.ent. I was only saying what you asked, Master Damien. Penny grit her teeth yet tried to offer him a polite smile. I apologize for offending you. She bowed her head, but the bow couldn't be completed as their head bonked together. The pure-blooded vampire narrowed his eyes at her, and before he could speak further, both her stomach as well as two servants of the inn entered the room with dishes that had been prepared. The servants started to place one dish after another, which watered her mouth at the sight of it. Not once had she had the privilege to look at so many dishes together. That was a delight to the eyes. Damien didn't bother to move, and he rather enjoyed her expression of embarrassment in the way they stood in front of the servants who didn't actually dare to look at the customers. But Penny looked flu.s.tiered. When Damien went to sit down on the chair, he left her just as it is before point his hand on the ground. It would be rude to not ask you to sit while I eat. Sit, he said before starting to eat himself while leaving her hungry. Chapter 13. Escape. You are listening at novelfull.audio. She couldn't believe that the vampire who had bought her was eating in front of her while letting her starve without offering a single bite from the table. She swallowed at the sight of food, trying to hold back the hunger that was churning in her stomach. She had thought the man who bought her was a good man, but she should have known better. Penny looked away from the food as well as the man to stare at the wall, which had a painting of a deer in it. It was a simple image, yet there was something very disturbing about it, with the way it was painted. Looking away from it too, she stared at the ground for the remainder of the time until the vampire was done eating. And over the course of his meal, not once had he offered her the food which he ate. It was understandable at some level of the system that they lived in. She was a slave beneath his status. Even an elite didn't have a meal with a regular man or a woman, and here she was someone of no value. But the irony was that he had placed a value high enough for no one to buy her. In the end, haggling with a word of a lie to give only 3,000 gold coins. Instead of concentrating on the food and the scent of it, she tried remembering the doors of the inn, which was somewhat similar to a mansion. She had noticed a door at the back. All she needed was to get to it and out of there. Far enough for the man to not catch her in this land before going to a human town. That was, she would be safe, thought Penny to herself. A human land, because they were much more trusting compared to the vampires in her eyes. With no brand on her skin, he wouldn't be able to do anything to her. He wouldn't be able to claim her to be the slave he bought. With that thought, she patiently waited in time. He was having the last course of his meal when she decided to put her theatrical skills to use, which were minimum. Her legs moved enough beneath her body for Damien to notice her. What is wrong? He asked. She let herself frown slightly as if in discomfort. She said, I need to use the bathroom. The man stared hard at her, not speaking and letting the seconds increase, making her worried. He hadn't offered her food and she hoped she wouldn't be denied to go to the bathroom. When a servant arrived at the room they were in, Damien spoke. Take her to the bathroom and bring her back here, he ordered the woman who bowed her head. The servant, who was a human like herself, had shown utmost respect to the vampire, but when she turned to look at Penny, she raised her brows as if she was too tired before leading the way outside. Penny, who noticed it, her eyes narrowed, but at the same time Damien noticed her expression. "Little mouse," Damien called Penny, who stood up, "we need to fix that attitude of yours. Go now, we need to leave in 10 minutes, he took a bite from the fork. Not waiting for another word, she turned around to follow the maid. As they made their way out of the room through the corridor, she didn't see anyone around and felt some kind of relief. Looking left and right, she asked the servant, "Where is the bathroom?" but the servant woman never answered to her, as if she hadn't even spoken a word. Sighing, she didn't bother to ask again, knowing she wouldn't be getting an answer. The shackles around her feet made her nothing less than a prisoner, and to keep up with the servant was hard with little movements. Finally reaching around a corner, the servant woman didn't say anything but opened the door, leaving it open. "Barium," another servant came to call her, "Mistress is asking for you." "Tell her I'm occupied with Mr. Quinn," said the servant name who had led Penny the way. "It is urgent. The spoons are missing from the drawers," the other girl whispered for Barium to huff. The servant woman turned to give Penny a look before saying, "I will be back here. Don't go anywhere," she instructed. Even though the place looked like any other regular inn, the place was filled with pure-blooded vampires. Anyone wandering around without a chaperone was sure to get into trouble, and that was exactly what happened with Penny. After she had stepped into the bathroom as if she wanted to use it, she peeked out of the room after a few seconds to note that both the servants had disappeared from there. Slowly tiptoeing, while she slid her feet across the floor so that it wouldn't alert anyone of her presence. The task seemed harder than what she had imagined, but Penny was quick. Taking a sharp turn, she went to see the back door, which was wide open. The door glowed in her mind, like heaven waiting for her, and she could hardly contain the relief that the sight brought to her mind. Turning around to make sure there was no one seeing her, she slipped and walked through the door to finally be able to breathe. Running was impossible in this condition, but she didn't want to hide here where there were people who could easily catch her. Looking forward, the inn was surrounded by trees, but it was situated next to the village which they had passed by before the carriage had stopped in front of this inn. For now, she could go there. Deciding to leave with the shackles still around her both feet, she readied herself to walk, but at the same time, something came flying from above to fall a few feet away from her. Penny, who was in a hurry to leave, stopped dead in her tracks when she saw a dead body lay flat and cold on the ground. For a moment shock took over her body and she didn't know what to do. Was she supposed to leave the woman who was on the ground and flee, or was she supposed to go help her? Her heart started to beat quickly. Closing her eyes, she cursed herself before going to the woman. "Mississippi," she shook the person, but the woman was long dead. Penny looked up from where the person might have fallen. There were a series of windows above and all of them were open. As she tried to wake the woman, she finally checked the breathing where no air came to be breathed on her fingers. The woman was dead, and like the woman, Penny's fingers turned cold. She doubted she would be able to run after seeing the dead woman lying cold on the wet ground behind the inn. By the color of the eyes, she noticed that it was a human. As seconds passed, so did the blood that started to spill and spread around the woman's head. Staggering back, she went inside the inn, her shackles clinking for Damien to appear before she could turn around. As if noticing something was wrong, Damien walked towards her, smelling something. "What are you doing here? Did you hurt yourself?" "Oh, outside," she stammered with a shaky voice. It wasn't the first time for Penny to see a dead body, as she had seen her mother's, but she had seen nothing like this before. The pure-blooded vampire gave her a look before walking towards the open door which led to the backside of the inn. After several minutes he returned back, his expression grave and dark. Without giving her time, he took hold of her arm, dragging her with him. His hand on her wasn't gentle, which made her flinch. "Ow, where are you taking me?" she cried softly for him to loosen his grip on her, as if he didn't know his hold had been tight on her. Taking a key from his pocket, he opened the lock of the door and pushed her inside. "Stay here," he said before locking the door with the key. Penny placed both her hands on her head. Oh God, what just happened to that woman? Why was she dead? By the looks of how she fell it was obvious that it was a murder. What was she doing here? She had the opportunity to run, she could have, but she wanted to see if the woman was all right. Panic striking into her system, she walked back and forth in the room to pause her footsteps after a while before looking at the door that had been locked. When Damien opened the lock of the door, his eyes narrowed to a great extent at the sight of the girl missing in the small room. With the window open, he walked towards it to see the length of the bedsheet hanging outside the window which had been knotted for one to leave the room or in this case escape. Chapter 14. Run. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Penny, who had been in one of the rooms of the inn, had successfully jumped down from the room through the help of the sheets by which she had descended down from the window. Her hands had been free, which had made it easier to get down while holding the bed sheets tightly with her legs hanging before falling on the ground. It had been a struggle to go down with her feet bound through the shackles, but that was nothing compared to her where she tried to walk as quickly as she could with small steps due to the restricting chains which didn't have enough length to move freely. She didn't dare to look behind and continue to walk through the forest. Walking by the road where the carriage passed by back and forth wasn't safe. She didn't know who the dead woman was, but whoever had killed her was still in the mansion. Though not wanting to be thankful for it, due to this mishap it had bought her time to escape. This was the window which she had been waiting for since she had arrived at the black market. It was obvious that the man would be busy, searching for the murder or involving himself in the mystery for him to lock her in the room. The deserted forest filled itself with the sounds of the crickets, chirping and hiding behind and on the trees and forest ground which was wet and slippery. Since the time she had been kidnapped to be brought to the slave establishment, the privilege to wear shoes had been stolen away from her, where now she walked on her bare feet. The rain on the previous night had been heavy enough to leave puddles around the land. Unfamiliar with the place, she headed straight without deviating from her path. Penny didn't know how much time she had before the pure-blooded vampire would notice her disappearance. She didn't heed to the possible consequences she would have to face because it never occurred to her human mind that the man would come to search her. Instead of worrying about it, she put her thoughts in escaping from here. The farther she walked, the closer her freedom and independence appeared. She heaved for air as she ran, but it looked more as if she were walking. At one point she had also thought to pick up the stone to break the shackle, but she had no time for it. The more time she would spend here, there was that much possibility of being caught. If it weren't for the sounds of the crickets, the forest would have been quiet except for the constant chimes of the metal clinking back and forth with her movement. At one point, Penny's leg moved forward which the other couldn't follow, and she fell on the ground. She huffed for air now that her body had stopped, the wet mud sticking to her dress which made her body feel cold. She pushed herself up to hear in time the sound of galloping hooves of the horse that approached through the forest. Not knowing what else to do, she rolled around the ground to fall down the little slope and hide under the large roots of the tree and the mud which had moved up enough to hide her. Penny hadn't expected the pure-blooded vampire to catch her this fast, but then she didn't know how much time had passed since she had escaped from the inn. This was her only chance and she was well aware of it. Escaping from the slave establishment was difficult due to their tight security. The guards would catch her before she would be able to pass through the gates. Waiting until they reached the pure-blooded vampire's mansion was not feasible too. Penny didn't know if she would be able to see the light outside without anyone not having a close eye on her. This was her chance and she had to make use of it. Covering her mouth and nose with her hands, she tried not to let her harsh breath be heard by him. Raising her head up, she saw the man on his horse whose back faced her. The hooves of the horse moving back and forth as the man continued to pull the reins of the horse. But then Penny noticed, this wasn't Damien Quinn who had bought her for 3,000 gold coins. This man was different. He had dirty blonde hair which had been combed back for the hair to smoothen until the nape of his neck. Just as turned, Penny ducked down behind the large roots to hide. Whoever this man was, he didn't seem like someone who had come to stroll through the woods. Rather it seemed like he was searching for someone with ferocity. At first, it made her wonder if the master had sent one of his servants to fetch her, but this man appeared to look off. After some time the man finally took his horse in the direction he had come in. With the man gone, Penny continued to walk to hear the loud growl of the thunder, and in less than a minute it started to rain. The water was cold as it fell from the sky on the ground. The droplets falling from the trees turning heavier than the actual drops, she continued to walk where some of the mud that had stuck to her body started to wash away. She prayed to God for her to get to the next village fast. Finally reaching a village in the rain, Penny found another inn and walked towards it while also making sure there was no one to see her shackled legs. Getting inside, wet from head to toe. Now that the rain had stopped falling on her, she shivered before getting to the little desk where an old man hovered over a series of parchment papers which was bonded with threads. Penny's dress ends dripped with water as they were soaking wet. Her feet had left imprints on the wooden floor which she couldn't help but turn back and notice. With a bright lamp burning at the top of the desk, she brought her wet hand up to hit the bell that stood next to it. "Oh my! You surprised," the old man replied with a startled voice, staggering slightly at the sudden sight of a young woman who seemed to have drenched in the rain. The girl smiled, her smile polite and warm where she tucked a piece of her wet hair behind her ear when it fell on her face. "Excuse me, but might you be having room to stay?" she asked the old man. The old man though appeared nice from the front, his first question to her was, "Do you have a silver to spare for one night?" "Yes, give me a moment," said Penny, pulling out a silver coin and placing it on the desk while also hoping he wouldn't ask her for more as she didn't have even a nickel to offer. After Mr. Quinn, the pure-blooded vampire, had locked her in the room, she had decided to run away while also knowing she would need some sort of money later on. She had searched through the little room to find a coat hanging on the back door, but there was only a silver coin in it. Believing something was better than nothing, she had carried it along with her while blessing whoever that coat belonged to. The old man leaned forward, sliding the coin across the desk to put it in his pocket. "Let me show you the room," he said, picking up the lantern which was hanging on the hook of the wall behind him. Penny followed the man where he showed her the room before exiting from there. She closed and locked the room. A silver coin was too much for one night to stay here, and though Penny would have liked to argue on it, but right now she was supposed to keep low and not call attention to herself. Feeling cold, she pulled the blanket that was laid on the small bed. There was nothing that could stop the tremors of shiver that ran up and down her body. Every time she heard someone walk by the door, she looked at the shadow moving left to right or right to left, keeping her alert as if the pure-blooded vampire had come to fetch her. Unable to keep herself awake, her eyes closed such that the night passed for the arrival of morning. Penny was woken up by a woman's voice outside the door and she squinted her eyes. "She's not here," said the woman. Suddenly she stood up and went to the door carefully. Placing her ear on the door and pressing it, she heard footsteps coming from the other side of the room for the woman to say, "Are you sure? That little ginger cat never comes up here." Hearing this, Penny let out a sigh of relief. It seemed like any and everything made her feel as if it was about her. When the footsteps and the woman's voice faded away, Penny turned the lock and peeked outside the room to see no one. The sky had started to turn lighter and she took it as her cue to leave the room. If she stepped out of this inn when the village folks would be walking by, she didn't need anyone reporting her. She had to find a blacksmith. Once she felt it was safe, she sneaked out of the room and walked out of the inn while gliding her feet to avoid the shackles make noise. Finally out of the inn where the old man was nowhere to be seen, Penny started to walk away from the inn to hear the last voice she wanted to hear. "Did you have a good sleep, little mouse?" Her eyes widened, her head snapping around to look at the pure-blooded vampire not standing alone. Next to his feet lay the old man who had given her a roof until this morning. Seeing the old man not move, fear and panic struck Penny. She gulped, seeing the 2 punctured wounds on the old man's neck. Damien wiped the blood on his lips with the back of his hand, a sweet smile on his lips that scared the living lights out of Penny right now. And she started to run again. Chapter 15. Little Mouse, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Seeing the dead man lying next to the pure-blooded who stood casually before taking a step towards her, it led to Penny to start running. Maybe a rabbit had better luck in hopping and escaping from the scene than her because of the shackles that restricted her from running. Damien stared at the girl with an amused look on his face, his red eyes sparkling with mirth at the sight of her. Before Penny could increase the distance between them, he had started to walk towards her, slowly catching up to her, but the girl surprised him when she turned around. "Don't come any closer," she warned him. It was true though, thought the pure-blooded vampire. A slave was never outspoken, and the last time he had seen her was a week ago, which meant that she hadn't got to go through the harsh disciplinary system of the establishment. There was fear in her eyes as she stared at him, her throat moving down and up when she swallowed to calm her nerves, which only excited him further. "For a slave, I should applaud you for your valor." He clapped his hand, which didn't seem least bit genuine, but as if he was mocking at her. "You need to be punished for running away from me. For disappearing and making me come after you." "I didn't ask you to come after me," she said, keeping a safe distance between him and her. He chid, a sigh escaping from his lips. "Don't be like that, little mouse. You were so well behaved until we reached the inn. Did the death of the woman damage something up here?" He pointed his finger to his head. "I am not a slave. I know that. I was brought wrongly. Wait, what?" she asked him, confused. As if the sun had appeared from behind the dark clouds, Penny smiled out of relief. "You know that I am not a slave." "Uh-huh," he replied with a twinkle in his eyes. "Then why was she shackled?" "Wondering why you have those still intact." He asked her to see a nod. "You were the one running since yesterday. Shouldn't you know it better?" "I know you aren't a slave by just your behavior, but that doesn't erase the fact that I bought you from the slave establishment," spoke Damien, looking down at the ground before raising his head, his steps circling her like a predator who was going to pounce on its prey while making sure its meal didn't have the opportunity to escape. "You cannot do that. I don't have the slave brand like the others," she blurted out, moving 2 steps back to stop him from circling. Damien stopped in his tracks, gauging the girl with his eyes. The smile that had fallen down came up again, making Penny worried. "You don't have the branded mark." "No worries. Let's take a small trip to the slave establishment so that we can complete it." "No," she exclaimed quickly in panic. She cursed herself for blurting out the last hope from her mouth to him. Mr. Quinn was a daunting man, his unnatural smile staying on his way that wrecked her nervous system before making it go haywire. "Why not?" He tilted his head. "I thought you the little mouse was upset for not having the mark on the skin. The slave establishment has a rule to not send the new slaves for auction, no matter what they are disciplined, punished, made to heed the very word of the guard so that they can be docile with their masters. Yet, here you are after a week out in the market ready to be sold." "How did that happen?" asked Damien, keeping his eyes on her keenly. "Were you exceptionally well behaved that the warden recommended your name, or did you recommend it yourself?" He licked his lips to see her eyes widen, and a wide smile came upon his lips. Penny felt her head go dizzy due to the adrenaline rush in her body by his words and question. No matter how much she tried to hide it, the man had caught her plan. She didn't want to go back to the slave establishment. For a slave to meddle with the list of the slaves who were to be auctioned, she would be punished in ways she herself couldn't imagine. Fear and panic were becoming one of the known emotions of her for a week. Wait, that she thought to herself. How did he know that she was in the slave establishment for a week? At the same time, Penny caught sight of a couple who were walking from the far end of the muddy road which led towards the inn and then to where they stood now. They were the village man and woman. She could ask them to help or gain their attention. After all, she still didn't have the mark being placed by the establishment, which meant she still had the opportunity to run and to be his slave. As if he had read her mind, she heard Damien warn her, "Don't even think about it," and her eyes moved to look at him. Taking a much more casual stance, he said, "I will take me less than 10 seconds to snap both their heads in front of you if you plan to involve them in this little escapee of yours. Think carefully, mouse. Your one wrong move towards me will lead to 2 deaths. Correction," he raised his hand, 3. "Forgot about that one," he turned to look at the old man over his shoulder. I will keep you happy if you come with me, he gave his word to her, the smile falling down and his expression turning serious. You left me hungry, pointed Penny. I promised to feed you, he replied instantly, all meals. Penny could hardly breathe, the anxiety of fear of not because he was a vampire but because she saw her freedom slipping through her fingers like sand. Why did you kill him? I had my reasons. There was a glint of anger that passed through his face in a blink of an eye. Come, little mouse. Play nice and I will be the master you will ever need to serve, he said, waiting for her to come. Seeing her not take a step, he exhaled. Walking to her then wait for her, he bent down, which startled her. Penny saw him fiddling through the shackle chains on each side of her leg. When the metal gave out a loud click, suddenly her legs were free and the chains were removed. Damien stood up, such an expensive and troublesome slave. He looked her in the eye and Penny felt as if it were a black space that could swallow one if one continued to look into his eyes. Let's go back to the mansion now, he ordered her. Penny only followed him, not seeing the thorn that was lying on the ground. She placed the same leg where she had previously stepped on a nail in the confinement room of the establishment. And when her feet did take the entire thorn into the arch of her feet, she felt her soul evaporate from her body to come back with the pain she felt. Mr. Quinn, someone called the pure-blooded vampire, and a woman appeared with neat and polished clothes. Greta, Damien greeted the woman. She was a human, her features soft, a smile up to her lips and cheeks that covered itself in blush at the sight of the man in front of her. But when the woman looked at Penny, who stood to stare at her feet, the woman's face turned sour. Her smile faltered, but she quickly fixed it, putting her attention back at the pure-blooded vampire. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Did you come here for work? She asked sweetly. Penny was in pain to take note of the woman. Taking a deep breath, she finally raised her head to take note of the woman. Brown hair and pale complexion, the dress she wore was undoubtedly made of pure silk. A hat on her head to protect her face from the light which was barely there. Yes, I had personal work to attend to. Now that it is dealt, I must be leaving, he said directly without bothering to exchange any pleasantries with the woman, which dampened her mood, but she fixed it right away. I will see you around, she said. Damien gave her a nod before turning his back and walking from there. Penny spared one more glance, both the women staring at each other with the briefest contact before Penny followed Damien as she limped. She walked on her heel, keeping the thorn untouched. Removing it would only lead to mud getting inside the wound, and who knew what this man would do. Reaching the carriage, Damien first sent her in as if he didn't trust her after her failed escape. Seeing her stagger, he helped her inside to sit next to her. Once the carriage door was closed, he demanded, "Show me your leg." Penny blinked at him. So he did notice something was wrong with her leg. It's all right. I will remove it. Continue disobeying me and you will see the consequences. He gave her a cold smile which made her raise her leg. Such an obedient mouse. He praised her to take a look at her feet. Without a prior warning, he pulled out the thorn and pressed his thumb on the wound for her to flinch. Thank you, she whispered for him taking it out so soon. When he placed her feet on his thigh, she looked up at him. Was this how slaves were treated? Or was this man having some of his bolts loose in the head department? He pulled out the kerchief from his pocket, tying it around her feet. I might have removed the shackles of your leg, but don't forget that you are my slave, little mouse, he said, knotting the last of the kerchief to secure it around her feet. Betray me, and I will punish you in ways you wished you were back in the slave establishment, he warned her with a small playful smile on his lips. Chapter 16. New home. You are listening at novelfull.audio. She gulped hearing those words spoken by Damien. Her body sitting crossed while her leg, which had been injured, still resting on his lap, finally felt it being released by him as she pulled it back so that she could place it down. A cold sweat broke on her back. His smile-filled words didn't lessen the threat he had casually blurted out to her. His words made her worry. Truthfully, she didn't understand him. She had tried to figure the pure-blooded vampire, but the more she thought about it, the more intertwined did his character turned out to be. He had claimed that he knew she wasn't a slave, or rather didn't have a mark on her, but that didn't erase the fact that he wanted her by his side. Running away from him seemed to be an impossible task. Every word he spoke, Penny had to make sure to listen to it carefully. He had failed to offer her food, but he had come in search of her. All her efforts from jumping out of the window to walking in the rain through the forest appeared to be pointless. She had wasted her time, but she had tried, thought Penny to herself. To not do anything and cry about it was worse than try escaping and getting caught. He treated her like a slave, but a few minutes ago, he had picked her dirty feet to remove the thorn that had stuck to the bottom of her feet. She didn't understand what he was trying to do. But if she was sure about one thing, it was that running away any time soon wasn't an option. Not to forget the threat. Once the carriage reached the mansion, the coachman pulled the reins of the horses to stop them right in front of the mansion. When Penny stepped out, she was gobsmacked at the sight of how large the mansion was. It was a tall, proud mansion that was painted dark gray in color, which was very similar to the clouds that hovered in the sky, thundering and growling. There were statues made of marble, situated midst the garden, that looked rather strange to her. Most of the statues she had come across until now, they were of beautiful women. Not that she was complaining about the addition of men here, but the expressions each one held here was filled with pain and angst. Their expressions, panic-stricken. A man with a black and white attire arrived at the door, stepping out to take Damien's coat. While Penny was busy taking in the strange statues and beautiful garden that surrounded them, the butler inquired, "Master Damien, who is that?" Though the servant already knew, he wanted to confirm if what he understood by the young girl's clothes, if it was true. "She is my pet. Falcon, clear the room that is next to mine." The butler slowly turned his gaze from the girl to his master. "So his master did buy a slave. Would you want it to be the left or the right one?" asked Falcon, waiting for his master's order to hear. "On second thought, it won't be necessary," grinned Damien. His eyes began to sparkle. "Yes, master." The butler bowed his head. "Where will she be staying then?" "The servants' quarters." "Foolish Falcon, why would I ever do that?" replied Damien, who was looking at Penny. He threw a look at his butler. "She will be staying in my room. Pets are not meant to be left out in the open where others can pet them." He then shifted his gaze to her. The mouse had to know who was her master, and that he would be the only one she would ever need to serve in this lifetime. She had been caught not by the cat but the wolf, and he would enjoy her slowly before devouring her very soul. Penny, who had been looking at the mansion, finally realized the two pairs of eyes that were looking at her. The man who had bought her was undoubtedly one of the rich pure-blooded vampires. For him, to have spent 3,000 gold coins on her, she should have known. She was led inside, the butler in the front and Damien, a step ahead of her. As expected, the mansion was spacious enough for 2 more houses to be built inside it. She caught sight of maids who not once lifted their heads to look at them. There were more than 6 to 7 of them who were either cleaning the walls and the stairs on either side of the large hall. "You are home late," a woman came into view who looked barely past 30. Her cheekbones were as high as the pure-blooded vampire who had bought her from the market. Eyes that were blood red like her lips were painted with color. Her brown wavy hair was left open, which stopped right above her waist. "Maggie," Damien greeted the woman who came to his side to leave a kiss in the air next to his cheek. "Mother was asking where you were last night." "How fortunate for her to remember," Damien joked with a hint of sarcasm. "She was missing you." "Grace has been out too," the woman named Maggie. Her eyes fell on the girl who stood behind Damien. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "You bought a maid." "We have plenty of them already," she murmured. The girl appeared to be around the age of 17, her blonde hair, dirty and mud sticking on her dress and some on her face. For a maid, she didn't look shabby, but her brother always bought good-looking girls to work for the mansion. And though every one of them stepped into the mansion alive, most of them left dead due to the lack of blood in their body. "She isn't a maid," Damien corrected. "She is my pet." he grinned. Penny didn't like the way the man addressed her, but she neither had the energy to fight him or test his patience. She felt like an animal on display with the 3 pair of eyes on her which made her uncomfortable. She had been tired running with the shackles around her feet, and by end of the time, it had also rained, leading her dress to be drenched with the previous night. Feeling slightly feverish, she swayed back and forth. Her head began to spin, a light ache at the bottom of her feet. Before the girl could fall down, Damien had swiftly moved to catch hold of her in his arms. Her body turned lax in his arms as he held her with his hand around her waist. He saw her head lolled back and her eyes closed. "Is she all right?" asked Maggie with a tilt of her head. Servants were never of much importance in the world of the high-class society of the pure-blooded vampires. Maids and the other workers were used by the elites as they pleased, like tools ready for disposition. A maid's health was of no concern. Damien, who had been smiling previously, looked serious now as he placed the palm of his hand on Penny's forehead. Her forehead was burning. "Falcon, prepare cold water." Without wasting a second he carried her up the stairs and to his room. Maggie was Damien's elder sister, the sanest of the 3 children of the Quinn family. Damien being the second and the third daughter, who was the youngest, Grace Quinn. Maggie had followed Damien along with the girl who was being carried and put in the same bed her brother slept in. "What are you doing here, Maggie? Don't you have tea party to attend to?" asked Damien, his eyes watching his elder sister with hawk-like eyes. "I was leaving." "Do you need me to call the local doctor?" asked his sister, seeing him tuck the girl who looked like she had rolled in the mud. Her brother had called the girl pet, which made Maggie wonder what her brother was up to. With his mood-flipping mind that kept fluctuating every now and then, she didn't know what he was scheming in. Somewhere she pitied the girl. "For what? She's a slave, she doesn't need one." Damien's words were curt. "Go now. You will be late." He gave her a smile that looked mischievous. "Don't do anything to her, Damien," Maggie stated in concern. "Don't tell me how to treat my things, Maggie. Off you go." He waited for his sister to leave. Once the vampiress left the room, the pure-blooded vampire turned to look at the girl who laid asleep out of exhaustion. "My troublesome mouse. If you had stayed put, you wouldn't have fallen sick." His hand, for the very first time, pushed the strands of her hair away from her face, pushing the baby hairs away and looking down at her face. The butler who had arrived with the bowl of water knocked the door first to see the master nod his head. Once the cloth was dipped and placed on her forehead, the butler didn't mention about how his master looked somewhere smitten by the slave he had bought from the black market. Chapter 17. Demon Doctor. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As consciousness returned to Penny, her eyes opened in a haze-filled view where it took her some time to adjust to her current environment. She looked at the top of the bed ceiling. Made of redwood, glass fixed above it where she could see her reflection. She looked unrecognizable, or rather in a state which she hadn't imagined her to be in. The bedposts that were carved in certain design were covered with silk-like curtains that twirled around on all 4. Feeling a breeze that came through the open window, her body shivered in the cold. Getting up with an aching head that felt heavy, she looked around the lavish room that looked nothing less than a king's room. 2 chandeliers hung on each side of the room distributedly, tall candles burnt brightly, enough for the room to have light, along with the fireplace that had logs of woods added into it with much of ashes, as if it were cleaned moments ago. Her body was covered in the softest blanket she had ever had the pleasure to even touch, the pillows fashionable, making one think of nothing less to butter that melts in one's mouth. The window, which was open, was at the right, the curtains softly blowing in as the wind moved in the room. Looking at the architecture of the room, she doubted this could be where she was staying. A servant of the house or a slave who was bought from the slave establishment was never allowed to this kind of privilege. Penny wanted to step out of the bed, wanting to go to the bathroom, but just as she tried to move her legs so that she could place them on the carpeted floor, she felt something around her ankle. Moving the thick quilt away from her body, she saw her leg being bound to one of the bedposts. Suddenly the door to the room opened, which had been closed, and she saw the Damien step inside the room alone. His eyes catching sight of her awakened self, he said, "Humans are fragile creatures. If you hadn't escaped from me, you wouldn't have fallen sick. You should be careful how you treat yourself." He walked to her with languid movements, his eyes fell on her ankle. Putting his hand into his pocket, he pulled out the key and unlocked the chain from the bedpost but didn't make an effort to remove the anklet attached to the chain. "If you had let me free." "Oh, are we still on it?" Damien's eyes twinkled as they looked at her. The girl's hair looked like a mess where her hair stuck around, her eyes smaller than usual due to the fever she had caught in the rain. "If you speak about it again, I won't think twice before taking you to the establishment to make sure you get the mark that you were meant to have before being sold." Penny wasn't the type of girl to go back answering everything a person said, but she wasn't the kind to keep quiet when she felt she was wronged. But then, she wasn't stupid to cross over the lines which had been put around her. Not when the hawk was looking at her without blinking. With her energy drained, she stopped and decided not to speak to him. Unexpectedly, the vampire placed his warm hands on her burning forehead. Penny's eyes, which had been dull, suddenly came to life at her mere touch. She looked into his eyes that stared into hers. "You are burning," he murmured. "I need to go use the bathroom," she said, unable to hold in the urge to pee. "Please," she added, looking away from him. Go on." Seeing Damien not move from the place he sat, Penny scrambled on the bed with the chain softly making noise, reminding her of her current situation. The long chain jingled once she stepped down on the floor and dragged her feet to the bath, which was 3 steps away from the bed. Damien's eyes followed the girl, taking in every single movement of hers until the curtain to the bath was pulled to close the view. On time, his butler knocked on the door and stepped in. The butler saw the bed be empty except for the pure-blooded vampire who sat with his both feet on the ground. The butler bowed his head deep before asking, "Master Damien, the food has been heated again as asked. Would you want me to bring it up here?" "She's awake." "I don't see why not, but are you sure?" "Sure," the butler prompted the question to receive a look from his master. "Will she be able to consume it, Falcon? It would be a pity if she won't be able to eat it in her current state." "I will make sure you get something very fitting depending on her health if it gets better or worse." Damien smiled, his eyes crinkling that made the butler gulp. Why wouldn't his master ask for the local doctor if he was not worried about the slave or pet as he had mentioned here to the mansion? But then, thought the butler to himself, the whole of Quinn's family, whom he had been serving for decades, now didn't believe in humans, or rather their value was as good as a shilling, which was actually worthless in their eyes. The family never entertained humans, and even if they did, it was for beneficial reasons. With the family filled with pure-blooded vampires and servants, who were a mix of half-vampires and humans who didn't need unnecessary attention, it made the butler wonder why his master had picked this particular person to be his pet. "The food is a type of porridge which should be easily consumable. It will also not cause any indigestion," assured Falcon. "As you are so well versed with humans, what do you think must be done?" "Her body temperature has no reduced since she fell asleep," pondered Damien loudly while looking at his butler, who had a good amount of knowledge when it came to humans due to his daily interactions. Damien had never bothered to look into the matters of humans as it never had concerned him except for drinking blood from them. Falcon wasn't a human but an average vampire. His work often involved humans, to talk to them in the nearby villages depending on the errands he was sent to do. As if remembering something, the butler wondered if he should tell it to his master, knowing how impulsive and insensitive he could be. "Spit it out." It was as if Damien had caught the thought passing across his butler's face. Odd that I heard a cloth bath in the cold water should take away the heat from the body," answered the butler, his eyes still on the floor, not daring to look at his master. "Get the food here," ordered Damien, to catch sight of the butler, who was dawdling around as if wanting to say something. "Who knew that the food would appear here by itself?" said Damien. "Ah, master, won't bringing the doctor to be more helpful?" "That won't be necessary." Damien was quick to dismiss the butler's suggestion. "The doctors in the villages are illiterate who know nothing. Did you know there was a case that arrived at the council a month ago? A boy who was of the age 7 passed away by the hands of the doctor. The village that comes right next to the Isle town. The doctor, instead of helping the boy recover, he dosed him as an experiment for his future medicines. The humans speak as if evil resides only in the creatures of the dark, but they don't know darkness lies right within and around themselves, smiled Damien. The doctor will be the last thing I will be looking for to fix my pet. Why did Falcon feel as if his master was referring the slave like a watch that had been broken? But the master whom he served for was a strange man. This whole house was a collection of freaks which he would never tell out loud, but there were some rare moments when it was worthwhile to work at Quinn's estate, but they weren't all bad. Master Damien himself was a strange man, but who wasn't? Everyone had a peculiar feature and characteristics. If he was here today working with the Quinns, it was because of this man who had helped him in the trial from being executed. The butler was an orphan along with his younger sister who had been taken in by his paternal uncle. He had murdered his uncle after finding his sister dead, who had been molested and abused by their own uncle. No matter what the reason was, the folks where they lived had blamed the children as if it were their fault, turning Falcon into a murderer when he had killed to avenge his sister's suicide after she had been unable to take the shame that she had written in the letter. Death was a serious matter, and no matter who grave one's reason was, it wasn't enough to take the matter into one's own hands. These matters involved the council, the government that looked after the four lands. No one knew except for Damien that the papers had been shuffled as he was the one who had done it. The proofs with other information that had been recorded were changed to allow Falcon to step out as a free man before being taken in as the butler of Quinn's family. Penny, who had been listening to the conversation of Damien and another servant, whom she assumed it to be the butler, her eyes were narrowed when she pushed the curtains away drowsily. How do you feel? I heard a good cloth bath would reduce the heat. Shall we try it, little mouse? He taunted her in a teasing undertone. Excellent. I feel better after sleeping, she replied, reaching the bed with the chain that she dragged along with her. She somewhere knew that he would not leave a chance to undress her. Slaves were usually brought for cx.u.l pleasures, she would definitely not let this man have his way. She heard the vampire hum before she heard him speak. Is that so now? How about you try unbuttoning my shirt? It is time to start with your duties as my pet if you're already feeling better, he said, offering her a cunning smile. Chapter 18. Be nice. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Though Penny had told the man that she was feeling better, both of them knew that she was still sick, which was obvious with the way her body lightly shivered along with the unsteady movements. Hearing his demands, she couldn't help but stop to look at him. This man wasn't a pure-blooded vampire but a demon in disguise, thought Penny in her mind. What are you waiting for? Taunted Damien with a serious look, throwing his head back a little and closing his eyes before opening one to look at her. It's really hot, a good bath would make me feel better. With your soft hands, I am sure to feel relaxed. Penny weighed the consequences of her action and words. As she had told she was doing better, he was already making her do his job. If she went back to say she wasn't feeling well, this night creature would undress her and give her a bath. The third possibility was her taking a swing at the man, but with the lack of energy in her body, there was little chance of anything going in her favor except for letting off some steam. How far would that go? Reluctantly, she turned her body to see him shift on the bed such that he brought one of his legs to fold on the bed while leaving the other as it was so that he could face her. She didn't dare to look at Damien. She was brave for standing up to the people she had come across since the last week. And maybe it was because she had never seen or known the darker side of the world she had lived in until now for having no fear. But what Penny didn't know was that her life had already started to change since the time she had been taken into the slave establishment where there was no turning back. Her ignorance of the world she had never seen was the absence of fear that existed in her mind. Penny, who was past 17 years of age, had never been touched by a man. She had fallen in love with some of the men as she had grown up but had never taken the courage to go speak to any of them. Even if she did, the men had different interests and standards that didn't match with her. After all, women in her village weren't short of beauty. They were well known enough to attract some of the black merchants who were involved in stealing and throwing the young woman into the slave establishment. Going close to Damien, she brought her hands up near his shirt while still not making eye contact. Her head had started to feel dizzy, unsure if it was because of the fever or it was the nervousness that was causing this reaction. Damien was sharper than most of the pure-blooded vampires. Even before she had decided to obey his words, he already knew what the outcome was going to be, yet he couldn't help himself from taunting the girl. His lips twisted up when he noticed her hands shaking and heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't something to be pleased, but he was more than pleased with this little response of hers. It showed the lack of experience she had with men. She brought her fingers up to the top of his shirt, the first blue button fumbling it in her hands, which she unbuttoned after a few seconds. Bringing her hand down to remove the next one, she undid it to see his muscled chest that was hidden beneath his shirt. They looked taut and hard. One single mark ran across one side of his abs that looked rather serious as its stitch was visible even to her blurry eyes. She gulped, and she did one wrong move of letting her gaze move up from his muscles to his collarbones. Her eyes sweeping up to see the neck and then up his face to meet his eye where he was already looking at her. His red eyes stared right into hers as if he were looking into her very soul, that made her heart shudder. The mischievous smile on his lips had fallen like the courage that had built into her before he had asked her to undress him. Even though he was the man who had bought her from the black market where humans were degraded without any regard, he had saved her. Enough to keep her not in a place like the cells or confinement rooms of the slave establishment. By the looks of it, it was obvious that this wasn't any room but this demon's room. It was Master Damien Quinn's room. What did he want from her? First, he let her starve, and then he had let her sleep on his bed. And now he was back to taunting her and treating her like a personal maid. It felt like he was breaking and building her to only break her again. Master Damien, she addressed him, her head feeling dizzier by the second. Her words were innocent, but it stirred something dark within the person who was in front of her. She slowly started to lean forward for her body to only fall lax into his arms as she fell unconscious. Damien's jaw ticked at the teasing girl who had fallen asleep on his chest. This little mouse, his eyes narrowed looking down at her. The audacity of her to fall asleep without speaking what she had on her mind. He carried her to lay her head back on the pillow. When Falcon arrived back at the room with the meal, pushing the trolley in, he saw his master sitting on the bed while reading a book next to the girl who was asleep. It seemed that the food would need to be reheated again. To make sure, the butler asked, "Master Damien, shall I bring the food back again later when she's awake?" "You can give it to the dogs, Falcon. Prepare the meal once she's awake," replied Damien, flipping the page of the book he was reading. Humans have nothing good to write. "What is with this book?" He threw the book right at Falcon, who caught hold of it in time. The butler wasn't an illiterate who didn't know to read or write. Therefore the writings looked gibberish in his eyes. Curious, the butler asked, "What does the book say, master?" "It's on how to look after pets." Damien's quick response made Falcon sigh internally. He hoped it wasn't for the girl on the bed. "I am sure master is intelligent and doesn't need to rely on what humans have written," the butler said for Damien to hum. "True. I should probably write one and send it to the library for copies so that they know that treating pets with care doesn't work all the time. It needs to be scolded and disciplined well." The butler had no words for his master. After Damien, as well as the butler, had left Penny to sleep in silence, as the pure-blooded vampire had work to attend to, she dreamt of the slave establishment. She didn't know why, but she cried in a room which was dark except for the coals of wood that burnt brightly in front of her. "Please no," she cried, but the man next to her heeded not a single word from her as he was used to these cries every day. Penny's hand and the head were restricted from any movement as it had been locked with the wooden board. Her back was left bare with the dress that she had been wearing removed to make space where the slave's mark would forever come to be etched on her skin. Another man in the room walked past her to go to the coals of wood, where he picked up an iron rod with a circular mark at the other end of it. The end burned bright orange and red in color, the steam and heat coming off of it as he walked back to where Penny was held. She begged and cried, but it was to no avail. The men were doing their job. The man finally placed the hot iron on her skin, making her scream further in pain. Her screams echoing on the walls of the room, and she woke up from her sleep with a small gasp. Waking up, she noticed the room to have turned brighter, which meant it was the time of the morning. She couldn't remember when was the last time she had dreamt a dream so vividly. It felt too real, and when she tried to touch her back, it was as if she was placed back into the dream before being brought back to reality. Her body trickled down with sweat, her forehead covered in it, and she used her already dirty sleeve to wipe it. The sound of the fire in the room had died out, only the wind breezing in, which was cool but not cold like the night before. It seemed that she was already feeling better, but how couldn't she? The room she usually slept in was as cold as the night she had passed through, the floor hard with only a measly sheet to cover herself. With the years she had lived, Penny had slept on the cold hard ground to know and feel the soft mattress on her back or body. Her mother and she never had the privilege to buy and use the cotton-stuffed mattress. For a girl who hadn't tasted the luxury of sleep, the bed she was on felt nothing less to heaven, what the people often spoke of after death. Was she dead though? Asked Penny to herself, for her mood to dampen when she realized it wasn't so. Not that she wanted to, but when the memories of last night flooded, she was overcome with embarrassment. Her body fell back and she pulled the cover up to her face. Not wanting to think about it, she decided to sleep for some more time when she heard someone enter the room. She prayed to God it wasn't the Damien, and as if wanting to clear her doubts, she pulled down the cover to see a maid who had entered the room. While she continued to act as if she were asleep, Penny felt the maid rustle through the trolley that was bought, but with no hint of smell. She doubted if it was food that was brought in. When the maid caught sight of Penny's act here, the girl was awake in the bed. The servant girl didn't bother to greet her and instead turned away her face like she didn't even exist. The maid folded the clothes she had brought inside but left it right at the table without going to open the closet that led to clothes. "Excuse me," Penny cleared her throat, trying to gain the maid's attention, who for God knows what reason was behaving rudely towards her. "Excuse me, but do you know where Master Damien is?" The maid took a few seconds of her own to respond back, turning her face towards her. "No," came out the short reply. That wasn't helpful, she thought to herself before asking another question. "Might you know when he might return?" asked Penny. "No." "What time did he leave?" Penny continued to ask for the maid to stop what she was doing and turn her entire body to look at the girl on the bed. "I am not subjected to talk to a lowly slave like you," answered the maid, turning away and continuing her work in the room. "Lowly slave?" Penny's eyes narrowed. Deciding to dive into the matter, she asked, "And how better are you compared to me?" The maid wore an apron around her thin waist. Her dress resembling some of the uniforms she had come to see in the local market who served the high mansion families. The maid was pretty with brunette hair and red eyes, which meant she was a vampire. It was a given fact that vampires were better looking than normal humans. If one considered a human to be pretty, in vampire terms it meant they were average, as they had better looking people. Sure, she looked dirty now, but Penny was prettier than this little maid who looked even younger than her with the way she behaved. "Listen, you slave. I know what you are trying to do." She did. Asked Penny to hear the maid speak. "Just because Master bought you here and is allowing you to sleep in his room, doesn't mean you are better. I know the history of where the slaves come from and what happens to them in the slave establishment. Is it because you were part of it?" Penny asked with a tilt in her head, making the maid narrow her eyes. "You wish, slave," huffed the maid. "By what I see," Penny paused to gain all the attention of the maid, "it is you who is running errands while I just finished my beauty sleep. Go on now, before I tell you we're snooping in the master's room for a longer time than necessary. Mark my words, you will be kicked out sooner from here than you can imagine and back to where you came from." That's the slave establishment. The maid didn't stay longer to talk and left the room with a quiet click. Something told Penny that if the room didn't belong to Damien Quinn, the maid would have sure pulled the door with a loud thud. She wanted to go to the bathroom. It was one of the reasons why she had asked for Damien, but he wasn't here. When she moved her leg, she heard a lot of jingled noise beneath the cover and she pushed it aside to see the length of the chain to have been increased. Stepping down, she walked towards the bathroom and let out a sigh of relief. At least she could use it when she could. When she stepped out by pushing the curtain away which she had closed, she found the butler standing in front of her. When did he even come in? She hadn't heard a single step of noise in the room. I have brought in food for you to eat. Please have a seat at the table, the butler suggested, his words and demeanor politer than his master and the fellow servant of this mansion. Penny didn't have anything against the man, but he did suggest Damien give her a cold cloth bath. Not wanting to make things difficult for him, she did as was asked and saw the butler sigh. Where is he, Master Damien? The butler inquired. He is in his study working. Do you wish to see him? We can go after. No, Penny was quick to dismiss it, I don't wish to see him. She hadn't stepped her foot outside this room and was still trying to let everything that had happened wrap around her hand. This was a new place, new people whom she didn't know. Not to forget, it seemed like she was yet to see a human here. Until now all she had done was meet vampires and pure-blooded vampires. The vampires fell lower in position compared to the pure-blooded vampires who were the master of all. When the butler placed the food on the table, even the normal porridge that her eyes fell on smell mouth watering. What porridge is this? This is made from the fruit avocado that has been dried and roasted before mixing it with honey and other ingredients. What a strange fruit name, thought Penny. It was the first time she had heard about it. Penny, who had been hungry for far too long, that when the food was placed in front of her, she couldn't resist it and pounced on the food before taking spoonfuls into her mouth and swallowing it. In less than 5 minutes, she had finished the entire bowl and wished to eat more. The butler didn't ask for a second serving. After all, she wasn't a guest but a slave that was bought home. Until and unless his master wouldn't order him to give her another serving, he wouldn't add another, not unless he had a death wish. But looking at the girl who looked sad, he wondered if he should give her another bowl. It wasn't as if Master Damien would know. At the same time, the fear of what if he got caught hanged above his head. His master was a simple man, simple than most. That fear lingered amongst the servants when it came to punishments received by him or any other family members. You can use the bath to clean yourself. The clothes have been placed on the bed which you can change into, asked the butler. He picked the bowl which was empty in front of her to place it back on the trolley. The master asked me to inform you to be presentable. Also, he's asked to not step out of the room. I don't think with the length of the chain I can touch the door, Penny assured the butler grimly, who nodded his head. That's good, the man murmured, making her think what was good about her current situation. Master Damien is a good man, so please obey his words. It felt more like a warning than praising the man. To let her know she would be in trouble if she caused any trouble here. I will keep that in mind, she thanked him. The butler took the trolley outside the room, exiting while leaving her all alone. Again. Chapter 19. Am I the food? You are listening at novelfull.audio. She had been unsure to use the bath, knowing well the bathroom didn't have a door of its own, and if any time the man of the room decided to enter, her very soul would combust out of shame. Penny still remembered the few days she had to spend by stripping away her clothes along with the other slaves who were part of the slave establishment. When the water touched her skin, it took a while for the dirt, sweat and mud that had stuck to her after the fall to loosen, to be pushed down to mingle with the water she was in. The tub she sat in turned light brown in color. Unclogging and clogging the water to allow fresh water, she poured the water on her head over and over again until the knots started to smoothen at the ends of her hair. A shiver ran down her spine, making her realize she had to step out of the tub before her body would catch a cold again. Taking the towel, she gently wiped it around her body while also making sure she had cleaned herself well, as she didn't want any dirt on the white fluffy towel. Peeking her head out of the curtain, she made sure that there was no one and started to dress in the dress that was previously placed on the bed by the butler, Falcon. Penny wore the dress, which was pale floral in color with flowers that was splashed here and there. The sides near her waist had lace which she was long. Unsure of what to do, she wondered if she was supposed to let them be. Unsure, she started to rotate around the lace, which was thick, to finally be able to tie it behind her with a small knot which she hid as if the dress was woven this way. As she had turned the lace, it emphasized her small waist, which increased in width where her H.I.P.S were located before the dress flowed down. The sleeves weren't long and were rather short, that stopped just before they could start properly. It was a beautiful dress. Who knew that slaves had such a privilege? Maybe it wasn't that bad, she thought to herself. Penny had been so into dressing herself that it was while she was tying her hair did she wonder why she was dressing up. She stared her reflection, a frown coming to place on her forehead. It was as if she was looking forward to showing the dress she had worn. Just as thoughts started to invade her mind, the door opened and her head snapped to look the man who had bought her. He looked handsome, some of his hair combed back while he left the other half to hover over his forehead. His full lips set straight as he looked at her. "The dress looks lovely," Damien complimented, taking in long strides into the room to see her in the dress, "don't you think?" "I was worried that it might not look so good, but I must say I have an excellent choice when it comes to most of the things," he smirked. And all the while he was blowing his own horns, Penny didn't speak a word. And then suddenly he said, "You can now take off the dress." Penny, who had previously been frowning, frowned further by his words. She took a step back without breaking his gaze. "Little mouse, don't tell me you liked the dress." Damien tilted his head while gauging her expression, which appeared to look at him skeptically. "The dress was bought for one of the High Duke's daughter. She has been asking me to meet her to shop, and I thought what better way is there than gift her a dress. She is of your height." The man raised his hand to a level where Penny was much taller, making her seem like a dwarf, but in truth, she was short when compared to him. He was a rather tall man, like many pure-blooded vampires that she had heard before. She did feel like a mouse in front of him. When he snapped his fingers in front of her, it broke her trance-like state where she was talking to herself to look back at him. An annoyed expression came to form on her face, which he smiled. "I should discipline you to turn you to be a good one, or would you rather prefer I send you to the slave establishment for some time so that you learn not to make faces to your master?" Upon hearing his words, Penny quickly schooled her features and looked down at the floor. This demon sure knew how to use the current situation to his advantage. She regretted internally for opening her mouth and letting him know about her not being a slave. Even though she didn't have a mark, that didn't erase the history of records of her being a slave. It was jeopardy she had put herself in which she couldn't come out. "You didn't think I would dress up my slave like a lady now, did you? I bought your clothes right here with me," he said, bringing up his hand and dangling the dull faded dress which she had not noticed before. For someone like Penny, the dress she wore right now would have not been affordable, and it would take her months or maybe years before she could have the courage to spend on something lavish as this. Though she wasn't happy about being a slave, it didn't mean she was unhappy wearing the dress she wore right now. To think he was kind was a folly, thought Penny when she took hold of the dress he gave her, and she took them without a word. The man was vexing, and she would repay him in the right way without using many words. That was right, thought Penny to herself. It saddened her. His words hitting deep into her chest, which she already knew and was taking time to digest. She was a slave, a person beneath all the status in the world now. She was somebody before being thrown into the establishment, but now she was a nobody. In this world where she had been pulled and dragged into, she was nothing more than a slave of no value or say. A servant at least had an opportunity to quit at times or be moved to another household, but a slave's life was bound to the master who bought them. Taking a deep breath, she went inside the bathroom and started to change the dress before pulling the curtain to stop his eyes from seeing her. "How are you doing now?" she heard him ask. Penny was annoyed to talk to him, and she didn't answer him when she heard him say, "If you don't want me asking you questions right in front of me while you change, I don't mind that. I am sure it will be more effective." If Penny's eyes had the power of light, there would have been 2 holes in the current to pass through and burn the man. "I have a headache," she answered. It was better to not lie with this man than being twisted around his finger the way he wanted. It was obvious that this man was used to having everything being played according to his rules, and even if it weren't in the rules, he appeared to be the kind who would erase and modify it to his liking. Deciding to speak, she said, "You promised to feed me." "That I did, and I think you did have a bowl." "Don't tell me you are a glutton," he taunted her, his words making her press her lips together where she pulled out the dress from her body. How dare he? Penny glared into the current. She might have been reduced to a slave, but that didn't mean she had lost her pride. No woman would like to ask for another bowl when she was being called a glutton. But was pride important than her stomach right now? Penny placed her hand on her stomach. She closed her eyes, her breathing getting shallower before she admitted, "I need more food." "Don't worry, little mouse. You will be fed once you have worn your clothes." While making sure he wouldn't enter the bathroom, Penny wore the dress she was given, which was loose and pale white in color. If it were the color of brown, then one could easily tell that it looked like a sack hat belonged to the vegetables. The texture of it was coarse on her skin, making her itch every time she moved her body. Before stepping out with the dress she was asked to remove, she narrowed her eyes before grinning quietly like a child who wasn't supposed to do what she planned in her mind. Finding one end of the dress, she pulled out the thread, one thread after another. Finally, stepping out of the bathroom for the second time in less than half an hour, she saw Damien's eyes brighten up. He took the dress from her and said, "Don't you look lovely? Come now, let's go get you fed." Without waiting for a reply from her side, he started to head to the door and opened it for her to follow. On their way, she made sure not to lose his sight, keeping up with his footsteps to find several servants who were already on their job of working in the mansion. He led her down the curved staircase before leading her to a double-door room which was already wide open. Damien stepped inside the room and Penny followed him until her quick footsteps slowed down at the sight of 4 people who were seated at the dining table while Falcon stood next to the older man who sat at the head of the table. She didn't sweep her eyes for long, as every one of them possessed red eyes. They were all pure-blooded vampires. Did she mishear when Damien had told her that he would feed her? Or was it that people here were going to feed on her as she was the meal? Next chapter title: Meet the Quins. Chapter 20. Meet the Quins. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Penny, who had been happy earlier when she had been told to wear the dress that was set on the bed, now looked dull and withered like a trampled flower who wore a thick dress that screamed of her identity. But that wasn't what bothered her right now. It was that there were 5 people who were seated looking at her before moving their gaze towards Damien. A girl who looked to be around her same age, but in terms of a pure-blooded vampire, spoke. "I think Damien forgot basic etiquettes of the dining room by bringing the slave in here," her eyes staring at Penny as if she were a rat that had come to spoil her meal. "We don't allow slaves to step in here, Damien." The woman who sat next to the man sitting at the head of the table was the one to speak next, who Penny guessed to be their mother. The woman had thin eyebrows that arched up, her lips painted red in color just like the girl who spoke. The vampiress' name was Grace, who was the younger sister to both Damien and Maggie, but not by blood. With their mother who had died early, his father had remarried, where the girl came to be their step-sister. By appearance, she looked very familiar to her mother. Blonde hair, full lips. Eyebrows that had been done just like this as her mother, making her seem older than her age, while in reality, she was young, immature and spoilt. A ribbon was tied around her neck, her brown dress looking somewhere close to the color that Penny wore now. Don't worry, she isn't a slave." Damien had already walked around the table, ready to take a seat when he caught Penny, who had stopped walking. "Are you planning to stand there?" The question was directed to Penny and she quickly hustled around to come to where he stood. "Why don't you say something, Daddy?" the young pure-blooded vampire girl complained in distaste. The vampiress stood up, letting the chair screech loud and clear in the quiet dining room. Grace, the older vampire who sat at the head of the table, warned, but the vampiress had already gone to walk towards where the human girl stood. Catching hold of Penny's wrist, Grace started to pull her for Damien to catch hold of her hand in return. "What do you think you are doing there, Grace?" asked Damien, his hand getting tighter by the second on his younger sister's hand. If the hand belonged to a human, it sure was going to have blood clot with marks, but even for a pure-blooded vampire, the strength that Damien possessed was too much to handle. If it were one thing the step-siblings had in common, it was that both of them were stubborn in nature. Damien's hand held Grace's hand, Grace holding Penny's wrist and Penny who stood still like a statue. Frankly, she didn't want any part of this hostile environment that was surrounding her. All she needed was food, but no, that wasn't happening. "Let go of my hand," said the vampiress, her eyes burning brightly. "Right after you, sister." "Remove your hand from her," Damien warned when his eyes flickered from his sister and then on her hand where she held on his belonging. "If you don't want to play your beloved piano anymore, continue holding it and I shall fulfill your wish." He mused for his sister to move her hand away, but the young vampiress didn't move away. Everyone knew how Damien's threat worked. Right after his words came the immediate action, and she believed if tested he would for sure break her hand without batting an eye. "We have never had a slave enter the dining room until now. Send her out, right now." Grace gritted her teeth. "Falcon," called Damien. "Yes, Master Damien." The butler came to his call, waiting for the order. "I need a glass of blood tea before I finish my meal. Boil it well, I don't want to find any residue in my cup." He ignored his sister's words and sat down at the table. "Damien," his step-mother said, "please tell me you don't intend for the slave to sit with us." "Honey," she looked at her husband who had been least bothered to involve himself into the early morning family charade. He wanted to have a decent meal and was something he had been looking forward to. "Yes, dear," he said, raising his face whilst stopping from cutting the meat that was placed on his silver plate. The woman gave him a serious look, to which the older vampire cleared his throat. Before his father could say anything, Damien rolled his eyes, turning to look at Penny and say, "Little mouse, sit down." He nudged his head towards the clean floor. Penny didn't expect anything less. Even if the Quinn's family was not going to oppose the idea of her sitting at the table, she knew the demon who had asked her to sit would have something up his sleeve to annoy her further. For a servant or even the butler, it was unheard of anyone sitting and sharing the same table as their masters and mistress. And here she was, a slave who was lower in status and position when compared to the servants. Sitting even near the table would be considered to be fortunate. The floor was cold, but the dress that she wore, which was what most or some of the slaves wore, prevented her from feeling too cold. Penny waited that a plate would be placed in front of her and she would be given food, but the time never came. It felt like something that was repeating for the second time in the presence of Damien. Various delicacies of food were brought inside the dining room, one item after another being placed on the table while being served around for Penny to only smell. "You really did get us there for a moment, Dammy," his step-mother said with a small laugh that was empty as how he saw her be. He disliked the shortened name. "Did you get her from the black market?" "I did." "Are you looking for a slave?" asked Damien while taking the loaf of bread and smearing it with meat by using a knife. "Actually I am. It's been a while since I had one." At her chiming words, Damien said, "Are you already bored with father?" It must be the years. His father, who had not involved himself in the morning conversation at the dining table, looked up at his son, who offered him a wink. It was no secret in the household that Damien disliked the woman and didn't welcome her as his mother. She was a woman who couldn't be replaced by his late mother. His elder sister, Maggie, who was 6 years older than him, was a kind vampiress, but he had never followed her footsteps of being an obedient child. While the elder sister was the most reasonable child out of all 3 children of the Quinns, the worst went to the other 2 children, who was Damien and Grace. His father, Gerald Quinn, had married his stepmother Florence Heathcrow when he was of the age of 15. Though he didn't object to the marriage as it was what his father had decided, it didn't mean he accepted the woman to be part of his family, which was known by all. Maggie was sweet enough to not cause trouble, but Damien took every opportunity where the words always moved back and forth at the table by his step-mother, his step-sister and him, with remarks that never stopped or got old. When his father opened his mouth, his wife laughed again to lighten the mood. His stepmother said, I am sure your father and I both will benefit from it. But you did well by buying a slave, this way you will know the ways of being a pure-blooded vampire. Damien smiled, wanting to tell something when his sister who sat next to him spoke. Will you be going to the council today? Asked Maggie, being the usual diffuser of conversations that took place in the family. She tried to reach for the salt which Damien picked it for her. I have been asked to not go back for a week. There are other things that need to be looked into at the moment, he replied, and on time. Falcon arrived with the blood tea in a cup, carrying it to the young master. Keep it here, he directed the butler, who did as told. How are things at the council? His father spoke once he was done with his breakfast. He dabbed the napkin on his mouth to place it on the side of the plate. With the recent massacre there must be a lot going on, the man inquired. Damien nodded his head, placing the meat-smeared bread on his plate. He picked up another loaf of bread, this time smearing it with the butter. The council is interrogating the Carmichael's butler over the massacre that took place in the mansion. They are hoping to find something out of it. Once he was done, he passed the bread to Penny, who was looking down at the floor. Seeing this, Grace, who was going to take a bite from the fork, stopped midway.